Good evening, everyone. Welcome to yet another episode of Telltale Tuesdays. I am Anuradha, your storyteller for today. Brought up on a daily dose of stories from the folklore and the epics by my grandmother, I became an avid reader, lover of books and poetry and other art forms. This love for books and the love for the language made me shift from my science stream to post graduation in English and further continued with MPhil in English and TESOL. Been in the profession of teaching and administration of educational institutions. At the outset, let me express my gratitude to Dr. Nidhi Rana for keeping alive the age-old art of storytelling and giving me this opportunity. I'm grateful to Dr. Preeti Sharda for introducing me to Dr. Nidhi Rana and my dear friend Rachna Mahajan for connecting me with this forum. The story I'm going to read for you is The Piece of String by the 19th century French author Guy de Mupassant. Remembered as a master of the short story form and as a representative of the naturalist school who depicted human lives and destinies and social forces in disillusioned and often pessimistic terms. The Piece of String is set in rural Normandy on the northeastern coast of France. The main characters are Maître Hochicom, an old peasant and the protagonist of the short story. Another character was an enemy of his, the antagonist, Maître Malandine, a harness maker. Now let's start the story. The Piece of String by Guy de Mupassant. Along all the roads around Gaudeville, the peasants and the wives were coming towards the burg because it was market day. The men were proceeding with slow steps, the whole body bent forward at each movement of their long twisted legs, deformed by the hard work, by the weight on the plough which at the same time raised the left shoulder and swerved the figure, by reaping of the wheat which made the knees spread to make a firm purchase, by all the slow and painful labours of the country. Their blouses, blue, stiff starch, shining as if varnished, ornamented with a little design in white at the neck and wrist, puffed about their bony bodies, seemed like balloons ready to carry them off. From each of them, 2 feet protruded. Some led a cow or a calf by a cord, and the wives, walking behind the animal, whipped its haunches with a leafy branch to hasten its progress. They carried large baskets on their arms from which, in some cases, chickens and in others, ducks thrust out their heads, and they walked with a quicker, livelier step than their husbands. Their spare, straight figures were wrapped in scanty little shawl pinned over their flat bosoms, and their heads were enveloped in a white cloth glued to the hair and surmounted by a cap. Then a wagon passed at the jerky trot of a nag, shaking strangely, 2 men seated side by side and a woman in the bottom of the vehicle, the latter holding on to the sides to listen the hard jolts. In the public square of Gaudeville there was a crowd, a throng of human beings and animals mixed together. The haunts of the cattle, the tall hats with long nap of rich peasant, and the headgear of the peasant women rose above the surface of the assembly. And the clamorous, shrill, screaming voices made a continuous savage din, which sometimes was dominated by the robust lungs of some countryman's laugh or the long lowing of a cow tied to the wall of a house. All that smacked of the stable, the dairy and the dirt heap, hay and sweat, giving forth that unpleasant odour, human and animal, peculiar to the people of the field. Maître Hochicom of Brieux had just arrived at Gaudeville, and he was directing his steps towards the public square when he perceived upon the ground a little piece of string. Maître Hochicom, economical like a true Norman, thought that everything useful ought to be picked up, and he bent painfully, for he suffered from rheumatism. He took the bit of thin cord from the ground and began to roll it carefully when he noticed Maître Malandin, the harness maker, on the threshold of his door looking at him. They had heretofore had business together on the subject of a halter and they were on bad terms, both being good haters. Maitre Hoshicom was seized with a sort of shame to be seen thus by his enemy, picking a bit of string out of the dirt. He concealed his find quickly under his blouse, then in his trousers pocket. Then he pretended to be still looking on the ground for something which he did not find, and he went toward the market, his head forward, bent double by his pains. He was soon lost in the noisy and slowly moving crowd, which was busy with interminable bargainings. The peasants milked, went and came, perplexed, always in a fear of being cheated, not daring to decide, watching the vendor's eye, trying to find the trick in the man and the flaw in the beast. The women, having placed the great baskets at the feet, had taken out the poultry, which lay upon the ground, tied together by the feet, with terrified eyes and scarlet crests. They heard offers, stated their prices with a dry air and impassive face, or perhaps, suddenly deciding on some proposed reduction, shouted at the customer who was slowly going away, "All right, Maitre Earthen, I'll give it to you for that." Then, little by little, the square was deserted, and the Angelus ringing at noon. Those who had stayed too long scattered to their shops. At Jourdain's, the great room was full of people eating, as the big court was full of vehicles of all kinds, carts, gigs, wagons, dump carts, yellow with dirt, mended and patched, raising the shafts of sky like two arms, or perhaps with the shafts in the ground and the backs in the air. Just opposite the diner, seated at the table, the immense fireplace, filled with bright flames, cast a lively heat on the backs of the rows on the right. 3 spits were turning on, which were chickens, pigeons, and legs of mutton, and an appetizing odor of roast beef and gravy dripping over the nicely browned skin rose from the hearth, increased the jovialness, and made everybody's mouth water. All the aristocracy of the plough ate there at Maitre Jourdain's, a tavern keeper and a horse dealer, a rascal who had money. The dishes were passed and emptied as the jugs of the yellow cider. Everyone told his affairs, his purchases and sales. They discussed the crops. The weather was favorable for the green things, but not for the wheat. Suddenly the drum beat in the court before the house. Everybody rose except a few indifferent persons and ran to the door, to the windows, their mouths still full and the napkins in their hands. After the public crier had ceased his drum beating, he called out in a jerky voice, speaking his phrases irregularly, "It is hereby made known to the inhabitants of Godeville and in general to all persons present at the market that there was lost this morning on the road to Bensville between 9 and 10 o'clock a black leather pocketbook containing 500 francs and some business papers. The finders requested to return same with all haste to the mayor's office or to Maitre Fortune Holbrook of Manville. Then there will be 20 francs reward." Then the man went away. The heavy roll of the drum and the crier's voice were again heard at a distance. Then they began to talk of this event, discussing the chances that Maitre Holbrook had of finding or not finding his pocketbook. And the meal concluded. They were finishing the coffee when a chief of the gendarmes appeared upon the threshold. He inquired, "Is Maitre Hoshicom of Briot here?" Maitre Hoshicom, seated at the other end of the table, replied, "Here I am." And the officer resumed, "Maitre Hoshicom, will you have the goodness to accompany me to the mayor's office? The mayor would like to talk to you." The peasant, surprised and disturbed, swallowed at a draught his tiny glass of brandy, rose, and even more bent than in the morning, for the first steps after each rest were specially difficult, set out repeating, "Here I am, here I am." The mayor was awaiting him seated in an armchair. He was the notary of the vicinity, a stout, serious man with pompous phrases. "Maitre Hoshicom," said he, "you were seen this morning to pick up on the road to Bensville the pocketbook lost by Maitre Holbrook of Manville." The countryman, astounded, looked at the mayor, already terrified by the suspicion resting on him without his knowing why. Me? Me pick up the pocketbook? Yes, you yourself. Word of honor, I've never heard of it. But you were seen. I was seen? Me? Who saw he saw me? Monsieur Malandin, the harness maker. The old man remembered, understood, and flushed with anger. Ah, he saw me? The clodhopper? He saw me pick up the string here, Monsieur the Mayor, and rummaging in his pockets, he drew out the little piece of string. But the Mayor, incredulous, shook his head. You will not make me believe, Maitre Hoshcombe, that Monsieur Malandin, who is a man worthy of credence, mistook this god for a pocketbook. The peasant, furious, lifted his hand, spat at one side to attest his honor, repeating, It is nevertheless the truth of the good God, the sacred truth. Monsieur the Mayor, I repeat it on my soul and my salvation. The Mayor resumed, After picking up the object, you stood still like a stilt, looking a long while in the mud to see if any piece of money had fallen out. The good old man choked with indignation and fear. How anyone can tell such lies to take away an honest man's reputation? How can anyone? There was no use in his protesting. Nobody believed him. He was confronted with Monsieur Malandin, who repeated and maintained his affirmation. They abused each other for an hour. At his own request, Maitre Hoshicom was searched. Nothing was found on him. Finally, the mayor, very much perplexed, discharged him with a warning that he would consult the public prosecutor and ask for further orders. The news had spread. As he had left the mayor's office, the old man was surrounded and questioned with a serious or bantering curiosity in which there was no indignation. He began to tell the story of the string. No one believed him. They laughed at him. He went along, stopping his friends, beginning endlessly his statement and his protestations, showing his pockets turned inside out to prove that he had nothing. They said, Old rascal, get out. And he grew angry, became exasperated, hot and distressed at not being believed, not knowing what to do, and always repeating himself. Night came, he must depart. He started on his way with 3 neighbors to whom he pointed out the place where he had picked up the bit of string, and all along the road he spoke of his adventure. In the evening, he took a turn in the village of Brio in order to tell it to everybody. He only met with incredulity. It made him ill at night. The next day, about 9 o'clock in the afternoon, Marius Pommel, a hired man in the employ of Maitre Breton, husbandman at Manville, returned the pocketbook and its contents to Maitre Holberg of Manville. This man claimed to have found the object in the road, but not knowing how to read, he had carried it to the house and given it to his employer. The news spread through the neighborhood. Maitre Hoshicom was informed of it. He immediately went to the circuit and began to recount his story, completed by the happy climax. He was in triumph. What grieved me so much was not the thing itself as the lying. There is nothing so shameful as to be placed under a cloud on account of a lie. He talked of his adventure all day long. He told it on the highway to people who were passing by, in the wine shop to people who were drinking, and to persons coming out of the church the following Sunday. He stopped strangers to tell them about it. He was calm now, and yet something disturbed him without his knowing exactly what it was. People had the air of joking while they listened. They did not seem convinced. He seemed to feel that remarks were being made behind his back. On Tuesday of the next week, he went to the market at Gaudeville, urged solely by the necessity he felt of discussing the case. Malandin, standing at his door, began to laugh on seeing him pass. Why? He approached a farmer from Crookport, who did not let him finish, and giving him a thump in the stomach, said to face, You big rascal! Then he turned his back on him. Maitre Hoshicom was confused. Why was he being called a rascal? When he was seated at the table in Jourdain's tavern, he commenced to explain the affair. A horse dealer from Montvillers called to him, "Come, come, old sharper, that's an old trick. I know all about your piece of string." Hoshikam stammered, But since the pocketbook was found." But the other man replied, "Shut up, Papa. There is one that finds and there is one that reports. At any rate, you're mixed with it." The peasant stood choking. He understood. They accused him of having had the pocketbook returned by a confederate, by an accomplice. He tried to protest. All the table began to laugh. He could not finish his dinner and went away in the midst of jeers. He went home ashamed and indignant, choking with anger and confusion, the more dejected that he was capable, with his Norman cunning of doing what they had accused him of and ever boasting of it as a good turn. His innocence to him in a confused way was impossible to prove, as his sharpness was known, and he was stricken to the heart by the injustice of the suspicion. Then he began to recount the adventures, prolonging his story every day, adding each time new reasons, more energetic protestations, more solemn oaths in which he imagined and prepared in his hours of solitude. His whole mind given up to the story of the string. He was believed so much less as his defense was more complicated and his arguing more subtle. "Those are lying excuses," they said behind his back. He felt it, consumed his heart over it, and wore himself out with useless efforts. He wasted away before their very eyes. The wags now made him tell about the string to amuse them, as they make a soldier who has been on a campaign tell about his battles. His mind, touched to a depth, began to weaken. Toward the end of the December, he took to his bed. He died in the first days of January, and in the delirium of his death struggles, he kept claiming his innocence, reiterating, a piece of string, look here it is, Monsieur the Mayor." That's The Piece of String by Guy de Mupassant. This story mirrors the problems of social injustice, its victims, and proliferators. Though set in a French village in the 19th century, this story is universal and holds true even in the urban area of the modern era. Its appeal is universality. The author illustrates the inherent distrust that people have for each other in this story, the stereotyping of the lower classes as thieves and liars. Hoshikam is so stricken by the wrongful accusation that it makes him sick. He dies uttering, "It was only a piece of string." That was a sad ending. Thank you everyone for giving me this opportunity. I hope you all enjoyed the story as much as I did. Thank you.